All right, let's get started. Any question about the exam? It will probably take the administrative TA a week or so, maybe less, to grade the exam, and you'll get the scores. All right, so today we'll go into the second part of language, on language development. So we'll talk about phonological development. How do we learn the sounds of a specific language? How do we learn what the words are in a language? And then talk about semantic development. How do we know what words refer to? How can kids possibly figure out what of an infinite number of things words refer to? And then we finish with the debate on nature versus nurture. To what degree can we explain language learning, language development, on the basis of very simple learning rules? And to what degree do we need to invoke biology, genetics, to explain our ability to acquire languages? So language development is nothing short of remarkable. It goes extremely quick. As a parent, you might be impatient for your child to finally start talking, but once they start talking, they don't stop. They talk a lot. And it goes very quick. So you don't have to know this chart in detail. I just want to point out a few things. First, cooing, this process of essentially practicing vocal cords and producing vowel-like sounds like ooh, ah. These are experiments by the child to produce some language. Similarly, babbling arises around 6 months of age. So babbling is again this practice of the sounds of a language. They don't form recognizable sounds, but they're combinations of consonants and vowels. And babbling seems to be innate. Deaf infants that by definition are not exposed to spoken language, they will also babble. Children that there's also ASL learners. They will spontaneously babble with their hands. So there's some innate capacity in us to just start to produce the sounds or produce some linguistic constructions. Then by the time of 1 year of age, children start to speak. They have some rudimentary vocabulary. And from then on, we see this amazing vocabulary burst. It's a roughly exponential growth in the size of the vocabulary. So by the time a child hits first grade, a typical child already knows like 10,000 words. And so one fundamental question is, how do children learn these enormous numbers of words in such a short time? So one important aspect in language development is the time at which you are exposed to language. So last time we already talked a little bit about phonological development, and that certain phonetic contrasts are learned only when you're exposed to those contrasts early in life. So Patricia Kuhl will show a video clip on the next slide. She did some fundamental research in this area. So she, in her research, looked at infants at various ages, from 6 to 8 months of age to 10 to 12 months of age. And she found that in English phonetic contrast, like ra versus la, that's meaningful in English, less meaningful in Japanese infants, that around 6 to 8 months of age, American infants as well as Japanese infants they're about equally good in terms of discriminating between these phonemes. But something happens between 8 and 10 months of age. Patricia Kuhl calls that the critical period or a sensitive period, during which exposure to these phonetic contrasts, the American infants are becoming better at discriminating these, but Japanese infants, they start to lose the ability to discriminate between ra versus la. So there's evidence for sensitive or critical periods in phonological learning. And I want to show you some a clip from a TED Talk by Patricia Kuhl that talks about this critical period, but also talks about the kinds of exposures that are necessary for good phonological learning. It is not sufficient to just hear this in a passive way. There also needs to be social interaction for the infants to be able to learn. So let's play this clip.
This way. Work in my lab is focused on the first critical period in development, and that is the period in which babies try to master which sounds are used in their language. We think by studying how the sounds are learned, we'll have a model for the rest of language, and perhaps for critical periods that may exist in childhood for social, emotional, and cognitive development. So we've been studying the babies using a technique that we're using all over the world in the sounds of all languages. The baby sits on a parent's lap, and we train them to turn their heads when a sound changes, like from ah to e. If they do so at the appropriate time, the black box lights up, and a panda bear pounds a drum. A 6-monther adores the task. What have we learned? Well, babies all over the world are what I like to describe as citizens of the world. They can discriminate all the sounds of all languages, no matter what country we're testing and what language we're using. And that's remarkable because you and I can't do that. We're culture-bound listeners. We can discriminate the sounds of our own language, but not those of foreign languages. So the question arises, when do those citizens of the world turn into the language-bound listeners that we are? And the answer? Before their first birthdays. What you see here is performance on that head turn task for babies tested in Tokyo and in the United States, here in Seattle, as they listen to ra and la, sounds important to English, but not to Japanese. So at 6 to 8 months, the babies are totally equivalent. 2 months later, something incredible occurs. The babies in the United States are getting a lot better. Babies in Japan are getting a lot worse. But both of those groups of babies are preparing for exactly the language that they're going to learn. So the question is, what's happening during this critical 2-month period? This is the critical period for sound development. But what's going on up there? So there are 2 things going on. The first is that the babies are listening intently to us, and they're taking statistics as they listen to us talk. They're taking statistics. So listen to 2 mothers speaking motherese, the universal language we use when we talk to kids. First in English and then in Japanese.
Ah, I love your big blue eyes. So pretty and nice. うわー、大きな茶色いお目目。そして綺麗な黒い髪。
During the production of speech, when babies listen, what they're doing is taking statistics on the language that they hear. And those distributions grow. And what we've learned is that babies are sensitive to the statistics, and the statistics of Japanese and English are very, very different. English has a lot of R's and L's, the distribution shows, and the distribution of Japanese is totally different, where we see a group of intermediate sounds, which is known as the Japanese R. So babies absorb the statistics of the language, and it changes their brains. It changes them from the citizens of the world to the culture-bound listeners that we are. But we as adults are no longer absorbing those statistics. We're governed by the representations in memory that were formed early in development. So what we're seeing here is changing our models of what the critical period is about. We're arguing from a mathematical standpoint, but the learning of language material may slow down when our distributions stabilize. It's raising lots of questions about bilingual people. Bilinguals must keep 2 sets of statistics in mind at once and flip between them, one after the other, depending on who they're speaking to. So we asked ourselves, can the babies take statistics on a brand new language? And we tested this by exposing American babies who'd never heard a second language to Mandarin for the first time during the critical period. We knew that when monolinguals were tested in Taipei and Seattle on the Mandarin sounds, they showed the same pattern. 6 to 8 months, they're totally equivalent. 2 months later, something incredible happens. But the Taiwanese babies are getting better, not the American babies. What we did was expose American babies during this period to Mandarin. It was like having Mandarin relatives come and visit for a month and move into your house and talk to the babies for 12 sessions. Here's what it looked like in the laboratory.
发生什么事情哦？小小熊七七在这里，一个绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转1、2、3。
So what have we done to their little brains? We had to run a control group to make sure that just coming into the laboratory didn't improve your Mandarin skills. So a group of babies came in and listened to English, and we can see from the graph that exposure to English didn't improve their Mandarin. But look what happened to the babies exposed to Mandarin for 12 sessions. They were as good as the babies in Taiwan who'd been listening for 10.5 months. What it demonstrated is that babies take statistics on a new language. Whatever you put in front of them, they'll take statistics on. But we wondered what role the human being played in this learning exercise. So we ran another group of babies in which the kids would get the same dosage, the same 12 sessions, but over a television set. And another group of babies who had just audio exposure and looked at a teddy bear on the screen. What did we do to their brains? What you see here is the audio result, no learning whatsoever, and the video result. No learning whatsoever. It takes a human being for babies to take their statistics. The social brain is controlling when the babies are taking their statistics.
All right. So there's a couple of important observations here. So she talks about statistics, that infants are constantly absorbing the statistics of their environment and learning from it. But it's not just any statistics. There has to be some social interaction at the same time for the kids to really learn something. So these are the graphs that she was essentially showing, but these are just shown in a different format. These are lifted from the eventual publication on this research. So just to go over the findings again, but in this different format. So in the lab, some of these American infants, they were exposed to this person talking Chinese for just 12 sessions, right? Pretty short. And this exposure led them to be much better in this phonetic contrast that's important in Chinese, as opposed to the American infants that were just exposed to English, right? So exposure by itself during this critical period of between 10 and 12 months of age, or I should say between 8 and 10 months of age, is very important. Then this graph shows that the social interaction is key. So some of these kids were just put in front of a television screen and they were seeing the same thing, but just unfolding over television. Some kids only got the audio only, and these kids didn't learn very much at all. They were as knowledgeable about this Chinese contrast as the American infants that never heard this contrast. And finally, these American infants that were exposed to Chinese, they are as good as the Chinese infants of similar age. So that's a remarkable finding, and it suggests that you shouldn't just plop your kid in front of a TV screen. Interaction is key, right? They pay very close attention to who is doing the talking and in what context they're talking. All right, so one important bit is about phonological development. Then once you have learned the phonemes, another important challenge is how do you learn the words themselves? How do you put the phonemes or syllables together to form words? And we talked before about a puzzle here, that there are no word boundaries in the actual acoustic signal. There are no pauses between words. So how can a child then learn where the boundaries are if it's not in the actual raw signal. And the proposal here from recent research is that children learn from the statistical information in the speech stream. Children learn from the co-occurrence statistics between syllables and phonemes. So here's the idea. So if there's a constant stream of syllables, and at some point in the sequence we have P, Beh, B, and again, there's no explicit boundary between pretty and baby, how can a child learn that pretty belongs together and Beh, B, those two syllables, also belong together? Well, one idea is to look at these co-occurrence statistics. Syllables that are part of the same word, they should co-occur more frequently than syllables that are part of different words. So there should be high likelihood of the syllable T following pre. Similarly, the syllable B or Bai should follow it's likely to follow Beh. On the other hand, the syllable Ba from baby is unlikely to follow T. I mean, it does happen, right, as when you say pretty baby, but overall, those occurrences should be far less likely than those transition probabilities within particular words. So the proposal here is that infants, they will make this assumption that transitions within words are quite systematic, that they follow some patterns, that transitions between words that are more random or more arbitrary, and that the differences in these statistics can be used to infer word boundaries and word units. So if this is true, then you can expose infants who have this remarkable ability to some random speech stream, some made-up, synthesized sounds and words, and see if they can learn the now synthetic word boundaries. So in one research study, infants were exposed to this 2-minute audio clip. Now, have you learned the words of this language? So the way this was constructed, these are the words of that language, right, as shown, as highlighted by these colors. They were made up of just these random syllables that were put together. But once these random words were formed, they were repeated, at random positions, so that you get these high probability transitions within words, like the syllable po is likely to follow T, and these low likelihood transitions between words. So in this study, this seminal study by Safran, Aslan, and Newport, there was just 2 minutes of exposure to this artificial language with these words, and there were no prosodic cues here, there were no other cues that could potentially be used to learn words. This is just, random words stuck together. And then these kids were tested later on either whole words in this language, like pabiku, right? You can see that over here. And part words, like kudaru. Now, these part words, they can actually be found as part of the sequence they were exposed to, like here's kudaro, right? But they were a part of two different words, right? So kudaro did occur, but it didn't occur very often. Now the results show that these kids were far more interested in listening to these part words than these whole words. So pabiku, the mean listening times were shorter than the listening times for these part words. And the conclusions from these researchers is that these infants must have learned word-like units. They must have realized pabiku is a word in this made-up language, whereas this part word, which sounds very novel, and therefore is more interesting to listen to, is not. And again, this is just based on a 2-word or 2-minute audio clip, so quite remarkable. So once the sounds are put together, the infant can detect sort of an individual word. You have this amazing vocabulary burst. So the child goes from just a few hundred words by the time they're 18 months or 1.5 years of age to 10,000 words by 1st grade. Now, if you work out the math, that's about 5.5 words a day that they have to learn from 18 months of age to 6 years of age. And from then on, it goes even quicker. So by the time a child hits 5th grade, they know 40,000 words, which means that they must have learned 20 words or so every day from 1st grade to 5th grade. So how did they do that? How can they learn so many words? They're not learning it just from the parent alone. They're learning this from many, many different sources. One key challenge during this whole process of learning words is understanding what words are referring to. What is the meaning of words? Some philosophers have thought about this, and they came up with some interesting puzzles here. So Quine wrote about the problem of referential indeterminacy. Basically, it's another way of saying that it's very difficult to figure out what words refer to because there's an infinite number of possibilities when somebody mentions a word in a specific context. So Quine's famous example is when a person points to a bunny that's hopping on a field and says, "Gavagai." Now, how do we know what the word gavagai means? Because gavagai could refer to bunny, it could refer to fuzzy, it could refer to floppy ears, it could refer to jumping or the color brown. And so when you think of it, there's an infinite number of things that a word can refer to. So how do kids then deal with this complexity, this problem of referential indeterminacy? So researchers believe that the children use a number of cues and constraints to limit the possibilities. So one is eye gaze, and the use of social cues. So if a parent is looking at an object and then mentions a word that they don't know, the child will assume that it's the object that the parent is looking at, right? So social cues are very important. The other assumption is that kids have some built-in biases to learn certain words in certain contexts. They're word learning constraints. And we'll talk about 3 constraints: whole object constraint, mutual exclusivity, and the taxonomic constraint. So the whole object constraint says that kids assume that words mostly refer to whole objects. You're probably talking about a noun. You're talking about one whole thing. So if, in this example, if somebody hears the word thneed, what does the word thneed refer to in this context? Well, it's probably a piece of clothing. It's probably something whole, and not some aspect of the object, like the fact that it's pink or fuzzy or it has a sleeve or there's a hem or that's made out of fabric. So the whole object constraint says, well, it's probably the whole object and not some substance that makes up the object or some aspect of it. And this can explain why kids tend to learn nouns before verbs or adjectives. So clearly this whole object constraint, it will speed up your learning of nouns, but it will slow down your learning of verbs and adjectives. The other assumption that kids seem to make, it's a clever reasoning process, is called mutual exclusivity. And the idea is that entities cannot have typically more than one name. If a kid knows the name for ball, and somebody says, look at the DAX, and there are two objects in view. There's the ball, and there's some other weird object. The child will look at this new object for which it does not know the name. And it uses this mutual exclusivity sort of reasoning process. I know the name of this thing, that's a ball. I hear DAX, that's something different, so DAX must be referring to this new object. And that's a very simple rule that you can use to apply to situations where you hear new words, right? And they could refer to many different possible reference, but it's probably the thing that you don't know the name of yet that it refers to. There's also the taxonomic constraint. Kids assume that words refer to concepts, and those concepts are in the same level of a taxonomy. So typically, words refer to categories of similar objects. If an adult says, I'm going to show you a DAX, right, this new word DAX, and talks about this DAX in the context of a spoon, and then later the adult says, can you find another DAX? The child will not actually point to the soup bowl, even though that's thematically related, right? So you can eat soup with a spoon, but will rather refer to the knife, making the assumption that a new word like DAX refers to similar object, right? It falls in a similar part of a taxonomy. It's some tool-like thing, probably, the DAX. That's probably what the adult is referring to. Now, a lot of language learning and language development is based on diary studies, where the parent keeps careful notes of what the child was learning at different points in time. And these diary studies, they're very labor-intensive to analyze. And then we still are missing a lot of context of, if a child mutters the word water for the first time, what else was around? Was there water when the child said water? And recently, there's a new method for studying language learning, and it's kind of extreme. And this fits sort of the era of data science and big data, where the idea is you can just record everything and then analyze huge amounts of data to find interesting patterns. This researcher from MIT, Deb Roy, he installed cameras in his own house and started to record all the activity in all the rooms of his house as his son was growing up. And he stored these recordings, terabytes of data, for over 2 to 3 years or so. So it's a bit weird to look at videos of somebody's house, sort of issues of privacy and snooping and whatnot. But he did this to understand the progress of language learning. And he extracted the progress of the word water over time. So here's an audio clip of how his son starts to produce the word water. Finally gets it right. So here's a short clip where Deb Roy himself talks about this amazing setup. As far as I understand, he's the only one that has ever done this, to analyze these huge amounts of data, these terabytes of data that come from this experiment. And it's not quite clear what he has found, but he has some very interesting and cool visualizations of the data, like what is happening or what is around the child when the child is muttering the word water.
But that's looking at the speech context. What about the visual context? We're now looking at, think of this as a dollhouse cutaway of our house. We've taken those circular fisheye lens cameras and we've done some optical corrections, and then we can bring it into three-dimensional light. So welcome to my home. This is a moment, one moment captured across multiple cameras. The reason we did this is to create the ultimate memory machine where you can go back and interactively fly around and then breathe video life into this system. What I'm going to do is give you an accelerated view of 30 minutes, again, of just life in the living room. That's me and my son on the floor. And there's video analytics that are tracking our movements. My son is leaving red ink, I'm leaving green ink. We're now on the couch looking out through the window at cars passing by, and finally my son playing in a walking toy by himself. Now we freeze the action, 30 minutes. We turn time to the vertical axis, and we open up for a view of these interaction traces we've just left behind. And we see these amazing structures. These little knots of two colors of thread we call social hotspots. The spiral thread we call a solo hotspot. And we think that these affect the way language is learned. What we'd like to do is start understanding the interaction between these patterns and the language that my son is exposed to see if we can predict how the structure of when words are heard affects when they're learned. So in other words, the relationship between words and what they're about in the world. So here's how we're approaching this. In this video, again, my son is being traced out. He's leaving Reddy behind, and there's our nanny by the door. You want water? All right. She offers water, and off go the two ones over to the kitchen to get water. And what we've done is use the word water to tag that moment, that bit of activity. And now we take the power of data and take every time my son ever heard the word water and the context he saw it in, and we use it to penetrate through the video and find every activity trace that co-occurred with the instance of water. And what this data leaves in its wake is a landscape. We call these wordscapes. This is the wordscape for the word water. And you can see most of the action is in the kitchen. That's where those big peaks are over to the left. And just for contrast, we can do this with any word. We can take the word bye, as in goodbye, and we're now zoomed in over the entrance to the house, and we look and we find, as you'd expect, a contrast in the landscape where the word bye occurs much more in a structured way. So we're using these structures to start predicting the order of language acquisition, and that's sort of ongoing work now. In my lab, which
So this is where the field will go to. It's like this enormously data-intense way of doing research. And honestly, I'm not sure what new thing he actually learned based on this expensive setup. So he learned that the word water was learned in the context of water in the kitchen. So maybe we didn't need this kind of setup to learn that. But the hope is that we can sort of simulate language learners, put them in these kinds of environments and see if we can approximate human language learning with some artificial language learning and see if we can understand that process a little bit better. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, then the last topic is the interplay between nature and nurture in language development. So this goes back to classic debates in philosophy. How much of our knowledge is based on just experience, exposure to the environment, and how much of this is based on biological predispositions, that we have some innate ability to learn certain things. So that's the nature argument. And some language researchers, they would like to argue that learning a language is like learning a skill. It's like learning a bike. It's all based on just accumulating experiences. But there's not, you don't need any special explanation in terms of genetics or biology. And other people point out, well, there's some fundamental problems with sort of nurture arguments, that you can't get to the complexity of language from simple learning rules. So first, let's separate two different questions here. So there's an easy question that everybody agrees on. We all learn a specific language. So the language that we learn, the specific one, is that due to nature or nurture? So most people would say that's nurture, right? You learn English, that's what you're exposed to, that's your experience, and that's your language. The difficult question, and this is where there's a lot of debate, the ability to acquire a language, right? The knowledge of these abstract rules, especially about grammar, does that come from nature or nurture? Can that be learned from experience? And different researchers would give you different answers. So in terms of the nurture argument, behaviorists, they fell down very clearly on the role of very simple learning algorithms, learning rules that can explain all of language, in fact all of cognition. And so they pointed out that infants often learn by imitation, or some aspects by imitation. They learn by association. So clearly, whenever the parent is showing a toy elephant and says elephant, it's easy to form that association between the object and the word. And clearly a big part of word learning is learned by association. Some learning could be happening by conditioning, right? So as you watch your child babble and the kid stumbles on some word that actually is meaningful, like the first time the child says dada, as a father you heavily reinforce that word. You really like that word. You shower your baby with attention to try to sort of recreate that word over and over. And so what Skinner talked about in his behaviorist sort of research tradition nowadays is more known as statistical learning. The idea that statistical learning mechanisms can explain much, if not most, of language learning. But there are limits on the role of reinforcement and what you can learn from reinforcements and feedback. Parents rarely provide negative feedback on grammar. So if the child says, Barney be going soon, and makes his grammatical mistake, then the mother, in this case, might say, oh, that's right, good job, Barney will be over in a little while, then we need to go to the store. So the mother here is reinforcing, in fact, the wrong grammar, but the right idea, right? And parents in general rarely try to correct incorrect grammar. It's almost futile if you do so. It would be very time-consuming. So children are extracting grammatical patterns without sort of feedback from their parents. And in fact, so as I said, so attempts to correct children's syntax and grammar are somewhat futile. The children don't learn very easily from this kind of feedback. So in this exchange, my teacher holded the baby rabbits and we patted them, and the mother tries to correct. Did you say your teacher held the baby rabbits? Yes. What did you say she did? She holded the baby rabbits and we patted them. Did you say she held them tightly? No, she holded them loosely. The child is not catching on to this mistake and will not learn this overregulation error just based on the parent feedback. So, besides this notion of learning from reinforcement, and that's problematic, there's a number of other findings that a behaviorist simple learning account cannot explain in terms of language development. So one is the formation of new words and utterances that infants are never exposed to. The phenomenon of sensitive periods for language development. The creation of new languages, creolization, and the inability of non-human species to learn complex languages. So let's go over those first 3 points. So children sometimes produce words that they really have never been exposed to, right? So the grammatical error of producing hold it versus held. The parent never says hold it, so where did this error come from? So this clearly, this error hold it, this comes from this tendency of children to try to find patterns in language and try to over-regularize the formation of past tense by just sticking on ed to every word to form the past tense. And some researchers would say that tendency to find patterns, that's innate. That argues for a nativist account. Other researchers say that the presence of sensitive periods for language learning also points to a strong biological basis for language development. So there's some very sad cases where children were not exposed to language at all for an early part of their life. And some of those kids, they recovered, and some of those kids did not. But what really mattered was the age at which they were found and when they were exposed to a rich linguistic environment. So there's the famous case of Jeannie from a Los Angeles suburb in the 1970s that was abused by her father, was never exposed to language for some crazy reason. The father didn't like language or language muttered by the child. And she was found at the age of 14 and put in a nice, caring environment, exposed to, a rich linguistic environment. But Jeannie never recovered from this early lack of exposure, and she never really learned the rules of grammar. On the other hand, Isabella, another famous case, she was found in the 1930s at age 6½. Rather bizarre circumstance where she was living with her mother locked up in a room by the rest of the family. Her mother was deaf-mute, and they were both separated from the rest of the family, and the rest of the family was crazy, did not allow them to escape from the house or be exposed to any language. But Isabella, when she was found and when she escaped, she was able to recover from this early lack of exposure. And within about 1.5 to 2 years of age, she developed sort of a normal IQ. And by the end, in a few years, she acquired a normal vocabulary. So the conclusion here is that exposure to language before the onset of puberty is probably required to learn language at all, or at least learn the sort of more complex patterns of language involving grammar. And that points to a role of the brain, that the brain, as it's maturing, is able to acquire sort of new patterns, learn the language, and once it's matured, it's no longer able to learn language, at least to native fluency. I'll skip this. The other really interesting finding relates to the formation of new languages, Creole languages. That researchers also point to evidence for nativism. So Creole languages are languages based on a combination of 2 or more languages, but they are the native language for its speaker. So how did these languages come about? During the 19th century, on slave plantations, the slaves from Africa, they were mixed up. And slaves with very different backgrounds, different languages, they were all put together, And nobody could really communicate well with each other because there were all these different linguistic backgrounds. The slave owners did this on purpose to prevent the slaves from communicating effectively with each other in order to escape. But as a result, there was this a problem of communication, and the adults, they formed a pidgin language. This is a contact language, mostly a face-to-face spoken language that has almost no grammar. So the adults basically are figuring out words to refer to objects, but there's very little syntax. Now, the children that grew up on these plantations and they were exposed to the pidgin of their parents, they, amazingly, they did not learn pidgin, they created their own language. And these are Creole languages where the children are actually imposing some grammatical structure on the language. So they're creating new rules from scratch, and these rules are as complicated as any other language out there. So clearly the kids, they were not exposed to grammar, right, but created the grammar anyway. And so this suggests, according to some researchers, that there must have been a biological predisposition to learn the grammar or to learn sort of high, more abstract rules of grammar. That there's an innate bias to do so because they were simply not exposed to those rules to begin with. So findings like this has led some famous linguists like Noam Chomsky to argue for this nativist view. That yes, some aspects of language can be learned from experience and statistics, but in the end you need to invoke some concept that relates to biology or genetics. And Noam Chomsky at the time, and this is a little outdated, he came up with this concept of a language acquisition device. He said, humans, somewhere in their brain there must be some neurological structure, and only humans have that structure, and this structure will govern your language learning. It basically gives you an ability to learn the rules of any language. It doesn't say what language you will learn specifically. And there's a lot of debate about whether we actually have a language acquisition device or not, whether animals are lacking such a device. So this is a very strong nativist point of view. Now, to put all this together, there's some aspects of language which can be learned from very simple rules, and just by exposure to statistics. We can learn the sounds of a language. We can learn the words of a language from very simple statistical learning rules. And there's considerable debate about what is required to learn the syntax of a language. Some researchers that are nativists would claim there has to be some biology involved, and other people would say, no, even syntax can be explained through statistical learning mechanisms. But in the end, for proper language development, you clearly need a brain and you need a human environment, and those will have to come together to acquire a language. So that's it for today, and I'll see you guys next week.